Genesis in chapter 6. We considered in our last study something of the type of world in which Enoch lived. And now we come to a time which is a number of years after Enoch has been raptured. And if we read in Genesis 5:32, that Noah was 500 years old. And Noah became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. This is the time, this is about nearly 600 years after Enoch has been raptured. Enoch proclaimed judgment to the ungodly, and they did not listen. The world became worse and worse. People turned more and more to sin. And then God raised up another witness, and that was Noah. And Noah was 500 years old. We don't read much about his life during those first 500 years. Then we read about that time. It came about when men began to multiply on the face of the land, that daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. Now, this phrase, the sons of God, is a phrase that is found throughout the Bible referring to a direct creation of God. Whatever God creates directly, straight from His hand, is called a son of God. For example, I'll just give you one or two examples of that. In Luke chapter 3, we read of the genealogy of Jesus through His mother Mary. And when you come to the end of Luke chapter 3, we read about the early patriarchs. And finally, in the last verse, it says, the son of Enosh, the son of Seth, the son of Adam. And Adam was the son of God, which means Adam was directly created, but Seth was not directly created, so he was the son of Adam. The only human being who was directly created by God was Adam. So Adam alone is called the son of God. Now, when we are born again, we read in John 1:12 that we also become children of God and sons of God. That is because in each person who is born again, God does a direct personal work. That's what makes him a son of God. Otherwise, it's impossible to be a son of God. It's interesting for us to see the usage of this phrase in the Bible. The Son of God is a direct creation of God. Spiritually also today, nobody can be a son of God by being born in a Christian family or by being born to spiritual parents. God has to do a direct personal work, creating something new, a new heart in that person. If that has not taken place, then that person is not a son of God. Now here in Job chapter 38, we read of the angels also being called sons of God because they were directly created. Job 38, the Lord speaks to Job here and says, where were you? Verse 4, when I laid the foundation of the earth. And when God laid the foundation of the earth, that means when God first made the earth. It says here in verse 7, at that time the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. This is God telling Job that long back when I laid the foundation of the earth, the sons of God shouted for joy. Those were the angels. And in the first chapter of Job also we read in verse 6 that there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came among them. So from these verses we know that the angels are also called sons of God. In fact, apart from Adam, who is the son of God, in the Old Testament, nobody was called the son of God except the angels. It's only in the New Testament where God began to bring people to new birth that you could say that those who are born again become children of God and then sons of God. But in the Old Testament, that phrase could only be used of Adam, who was the only direct creation, and of the angels. Nobody else was called a son of God in the Old Testament. And so, when we see that, we come to Genesis chapter 6, verse 2. We read, "The sons of God saw the daughters of men." This must refer to the angels. That there were certain angels who did not fall away when Lucifer fell, or perhaps fell away along with Lucifer. But when Lucifer and the angels fell away, they were not sent to hell. They were cast out from the third heaven, and they were sent to the second heaven. And as we have seen before, one day they'll be cast down to the earth, and then finally to the bottomless pit and to the lake of fire. But these sons of God were in the second heaven, perhaps, among the fallen angels. And then they were stirred up by a lust after beautiful women. It's a very amazing thing. And it says here they took wives for themselves. We don't know how exactly they did all that, how they could take a human form, and whether they possessed people, living people, but in some way they had this terrific lust, sexual lust. So they wanted to satisfy it, and they went for the beautiful ones. Here we see the beginning of, we can apply that spiritually today, when the sons of God look at the beautiful daughters of men and don't consider whether that beautiful girl is spiritual and go ahead and marry her. It's the same. It began with these fallen angelic beings who also saw that the daughters of men were good-looking and beautiful and lusted after them and went after their beauty and took wives for themselves. And the Lord saw all this. Now, if you turn to the book of Jude, you see a New Testament commentary telling us something of how God judged these angels, and that is written as a warning for us in this day. In the epistle of Jude and verse 6, we read about he says in verse 5, "I want to remind you about some of these things. One, how the Lord, after saving a people out of the land of Egypt, destroyed, that is 600,000 people were destroyed in the wilderness. And he says, I want to give you another example. He gives us 3 examples. 2 of those examples most believers are familiar with. That's the example of those who perished in the wilderness, verse 5, and the example of Sodom and Gomorrah in Lot's time, verse 7. But this other 3rd example, many believers are not familiar with. And that's also given as an example by Jude. He says, I want you to remember these 3 examples. And the middle one is about the angels who did not keep their proper habitation. And that word habitation is used in 2 Corinthians 5 to speak of our body. How we will change this for another habitation. And the angels did not keep to the limits that God had placed for them. God has not ordained sex for the angels. But they didn't stay within there. They couldn't keep a control on their desires. They abandoned their proper abode. That means the circle that God had drawn around them, they left it. It's just like when a young unmarried person whom God has not given facility for release of his sexual desires yet because he's not married. And he can seek for some release there in ways in which God has not ordained, through various sinful ways. And then he can think of the angels, who also God had not ordained sex for them. And they did not stay within that circle, but they left it. And therefore God has kept them in eternal bonds under darkness for the judgment of the great day. These angelic beings, God punished them by sending them to a pit. and binding them in the darkness. They are not loose today. We read of them also in 2 Peter chapter 2. 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 4 to 6. Here it's speaking about false prophets in verse 1. And it says about these false prophets that they will go along a life of sensuality, verse 2. And it says how God will judge them because, verse 4, if God did not spare the angels when they sinned. And that's referring to these angels in Noah's time who sinned sexually, but cast them into hell. These are not Satan's hosts, because Satan's hosts have not been cast into hell. They are in the second heaven. But these are another group of angels who sinned sexually, who were cast into hell, and that's not the same hell that the rich man went to. It's another word in the Greek called Tartarus, where they were cast and committed them to pits of darkness, reserved for judgment, and did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah. So you see, it's talking about Noah's time when the angels sinned. And Noah is called a preacher of righteousness with 7 others when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. So we see from these New Testament passages that the sons of God referred to in Genesis 6 are these angels who sinned. And we read another passage in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 19. It says about Jesus that when he died, he went down and made proclamation, verse 19, 1 Peter 3:19, to those spirits who are now in prison, who were disobedient when the patience of God kept waiting in the days of Noah. There again it's referring to these evil spirits who sinned, who are kept in bondage, the only angels who have been punished because they did not stay within their circle. They went outside their circle and sinned in a way which was terrible in God's eyes. And there we see the seriousness of sexual sin. And if we can take these warnings, they are a warning for us, because we read in Luke's Gospel chapter 17, Luke 17, verse 26 to 30, and just as it happened in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the days of the Son of Man. That means Noah's time is going to be similar to the last days, just before Jesus comes. There's going to be a lot of similarity. And then it says it'll also be like in the days, verse 28, same as happened in the days of Lot. What do we know about the days of Lot in Sodom and Gomorrah? We know that they sinned sexually in Sodom. We even have a word in English called sodomy, which is unnatural sexual sin. And it says about Noah's time also that the last days will be like that. And in Noah's time also, there was, in the case of the angels, unnatural sexual sin. And that's exactly what we see in the world today. Unnatural sexual sin. Ordinary sexual sin has always been there, but unnatural sexual sin has also been there, but more in secret. But now, particularly since the Second World War in the last few years, it's spread like anything. Accepted. There are churches for homosexuals in America now, so you can see how far things have gone. And it was in such a day. This was how Noah's day was. These things may shock us, but Noah lived seeing all these things happening around him. And those times are being repeated. And so we know, as we look around at these things, that the end must be very near. And we return back to Genesis chapter 6 and verse 3. And we can say that the Lord is saying the same words even today. As He sees the world, God looked at that world in those days and saw these things happening. Saw these spirit beings trying to move out of their abode. And the Lord said in Genesis 6:3, "My spirit shall not always strive with man, because he also is flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. Or as the margin says, in his going astray, man is flesh." There is a description for the first time in the Bible of the flesh. by God Himself. In His going astray, He has become flesh. And it is in that flesh that Jesus came to redeem us. The first time God uses that, He says, in His going astray, He has become flesh. That's what the margin says. Therefore His days shall be 120 years. That means God is still in patience, waiting, hoping that man will yet repent. The patience of God. We read that in Peter's epistle. The patience of God kept waiting in the days of Noah. We just read that in Peter's epistle. There was a patience of God that kept waiting for 120 years. There was a patience of God that kept waiting in Sodom and Gomorrah. And there's a patience of God keeping waiting, that's waiting still today on the earth. But the Lord also says, my Spirit will not always strive with man. For in His going astray, He is flesh. And we see that in the world today. But His days will be numbered. We can say His days are numbered.